Hello, my name is Alex Vela, I'm Vice President of the ISI Inkling Society here at CU, and it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Professor Jason Brennan is a professor of economics, philosophy, and ethics at the Georgetown McDonough School of Business, as well as their philosophy department, and the author of 10 books, and I think a few more coming out soon, right? Including the Ethics of Voting, Markets Without Limits, A Brief History of Liberty, and tonight's topic, Why Not Capitalism? His work focuses on the intersection of normative political theory and empirical analysis, especially concerning voting ethics and behavior, as well as the morality and outcomes of liberal economics. He's appeared on Fox Business Network, Stossel Q&A, PBS, and now here at the University of Colorado. And as I just found out, he's in a rock band, so that's pretty cool as well. So without any further ado, Jason Brennan.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for being here tonight. I know you were kind of expecting like a Mayweather-Jones sort of fight, and maybe just got, I don't know if I'm Mayweather or Jones in this, so there won't be quite as much punching unless you decide to punch back and we can turn it into a debate. So hopefully that debate will be rescheduled in the fall, because Larry Temkin, if you don't know him, he's one of my favorite philosophers. We don't agree on much, but he's one of my favorite philosophers. He's a really bright guy and has really smart things to say. So today instead, I'm going to talk to you about Utopia and what Utopia is like. All right, so what do we have to say about that? I don't know about you, but one of my favorite movies is this, Capitalism, A Love Story by Michael Moore. I'm guessing a few of you have seen it. And this is a movie that spends about 127 minutes complaining about the evils of capitalism with maybe a little bit of touch of hyperbole there, here and there. Maybe it's not always perfectly fair. But the interesting thing is at the end of this movie, Michael Moore says, you can't regulate evil. You have to eradicate evil and replace it with something good. And that good thing is economic democracy. It's strange because even at the end of this book or movie, like arguing about how bad capitalism is, he doesn't just come out and say what he really wants, which is collective control of the means of production, which is socialism. For him, even back then, socialism was kind of a dirty word, though, I wrote this in 2014 and now in 2019, it's got to have sort of a renaissance as far as the word goes. The thing is, people don't really use the word the right way. You go and ask young people and you're like, hey, which do you prefer, capitalism and socialism? And on average, a young person is a little bit more likely to say socialism than capitalism. Then you ask them things like, well, do you want the government to control the means of production? And they're like, no. Do you want all the means of production to be controlled collectively? And they're like, no. Well, what do you want? Well, I just want more equality and I'd like a little bit more welfare programs. That's not really socialism, it's something else. That's social democracy or something else besides that. When economists talk about capitalism versus socialism, it's hard to define in like one sentence, but this is roughly what economists mean. A society is socialist to the extent that productive property, the means of production, are collectively owned by everybody, or realistically the state as a representative of everybody, and decisions about what will be produced, what prices will be, how it will be produced, who will work and what, are going to be decided by that group, the people who control that. In a capitalist society, the means of production are allowed to be privately owned, though even in a capitalist society, things are collectively owned. I have a retirement account with Georgetown, and it's a bunch of mutual funds, which I'm sharing ownership of a bunch of companies, I don't even know which ones, collectively with millions of other people. Right? So in a capitalist economy, individual decisions about economic matters are allowed, and in a socialist economy, these things are going to be decided somehow collectively. That's how economists tend to use the word. You can break it down more fine-grained, and actually a number of different institutes, such as the Fraser Institute, which is a think tank in Canada, hires a number of economists every year to score countries by how capitalist they are. And this is a map. The blue countries are the most capitalist. The red, red or like the least capitalist, yellow's in between, green's like kind of right below blue. Right? So the most capitalist countries by the Fraser Institute rankings include the countries that the US Americans are inclined to call socialist, like Norway and Sweden and Finland and Denmark. The United States, Germany, Spain, Ireland, Switzerland, and so on. In fact, on this ranking, the US is usually about maybe around 18. Right? In some years, Denmark actually ranks higher and more capitalist. So here's what I think might be going on with Michael Moore. He thinks that the word socialism has a kind of dirty meaning to people, at least older people, because we all kind of accept this sort of story from the 20th century. The story goes like this. In the 20th century, the world experimented with two fundamentally different modes of economic organization. In some countries, like Cambodia, Vietnam, USSR, China, Cuba, and so on, they experimented with having collective ownership of the means of production, with socialism. And those countries didn't do very well. They didn't do very well in particular for poor proletariat workers. The very people who were supposed to be liberated by socialism were in fact hurt by it. They had a stagnant standard of living and their lives did not go better. Other countries like South Korea, Canada, Australia, Switzerland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, experimented with capitalist modes of production, and their people got to be a lot richer. And so as a result, maybe like we think, oh, we had this debate, there's nothing more to debate between socialism and capitalism, the debate is over. I mean, don't the facts speak for themselves? And what I want to say is, well, maybe not, but here's what some of the facts might be. In the year 1900, 95% of people alive lived in what the UN would consider extreme poverty, on less than what would now be $1 a day. Almost everyone everywhere throughout all of history was dirt poor and just on the verge of starvation. Today, by that same measure of extreme poverty, less than 10% of people are living in extreme poverty. In my lifetime, extreme poverty has dwindled down to almost nothing, and it continues to shrink. That's pretty cool. I'm pretty happy about that. It turns out that when you take the Fraser Institute's ranking of how capitalist countries are, the more capitalist a country is, the richer it tends to be on average. In fact, you can even see there's the trend line, and you might notice the more capitalist countries are significantly above the trend line. They tend to be richer than the non-capitalist countries. But if you're an egalitarian, if you care about the poor, you don't just care about averages, you want to know about how the worst off people do. But it also turns out that the worst off people in capitalist societies tend to make significantly more money than like average people in non-capitalist societies. So all the dollar amounts I give you through this entire talk, they're all going to be adjusted for purchasing price parity and the cost of living. So these are constant dollars across countries. You don't have to say like, well, it's cheaper to live in, Zaire than like Canada. I've put that in the graph. It turns out that if you look at just people at the bottom 10th percentile of income in the most capitalist countries, they earn, on average, around $11,000 today, which isn't a lot. That's not that great. That's like the standard of living in like the poorest parts of Appalachia. But it's on par with the average standard of living across the entire world. Right? GDP per capita worldwide is around that. And this is also, by the way, that money, that's before they get any kind of welfare payments, any kind of government transfers, anything like that. So in fact, the gap between the so-called poor in the most capitalist countries and the poor in non-capitalist countries is even wider than this graph indicates. It's better to be, if you're living at what we consider the poverty line in the United States today, as a single adult, you're roughly in the top 15% of income worldwide. And again, I'm adjusting for the cost of living and adjusting for purchasing price parity. Some people worry that, well, maybe it makes people richer, but it makes them more unequal. The interesting thing is, like, it doesn't really matter where you look. You get roughly the same level of wealth, like as a percent in all these countries. In the most capitalist countries and least capitalist countries, the worst off people own only about 2.5% of the wealth. But that said, there's actually a negative correlation between how capitalist a country is and how unequal it is. Right? So historically what you find is as countries become more capitalist, they start to become more equal, and then when they hit about $15,000 to $16,000 GDP per person, they start to become more equal, even before there's any kind of government transfers. So the relationship between, the actual empirical relationship between capitalism and inequality is kind of complicated. It's not just simply it causes it or doesn't cause it, it's sort of more of a curve. The curve's called the Kuznets curve, actually. Well, what about like looking at the poor? What do they own? They have a lot of stuff. So this is from the US Census Bureau, and actually I took this one from 2005. If you update it, the numbers are a little bit higher. But you find that like the people at the bottom 10th percentile of income in the US, the people at the poverty line in the US, own about 43% of them own their own home, 74% of them own a car, but got almost a third own 2 cars or more. Most of them have air conditioning. They all have a refrigerator. Most have a clothes dryer. Many have a dishwasher. A lot have color televisions and so on. And I'm not saying that like filthy lucre makes your life better, like perfect, and that's like the point of life is to acquire as much stuff as possible. I mean, it is to acquire as many guitars as possible. But other than that, that doesn't really matter. But nevertheless, if you look at the kind of stuff that the poor in the United States own today, it's on par with what was considered middle class in 1970. If you look at ownership rates of these goods in the year 1970, it's actually worse than it is for the poor in the US today. So some progress has been made. This isn't just buying people filthy lucre, it's also buying them life. It turns out that in the most capitalist countries, people have a longer life expectancy than in least capitalist countries. And if you look at things like, as countries over the last 20 years move up in the Fraser rankings, you also find that life expectancy goes up. When they move down, life expectancy goes down. And the reason for that has to do with, there's a pretty strong relationship between GDP per capita and life expectancy, in particular when it comes to child survival rates. In very poor countries, children still die at a young age, and that brings down life expectancy dramatically. And in richer countries, they don't. So there's other numbers here. We could look at things like the poverty rates in certain countries. And you find, again, like in the most capitalist countries, extreme and moderate poverty are much lower than in the least capitalist countries. And things like scoring civil and political liberties, they tend to be more protected in the most capitalist countries than the least capitalist countries. It also turns out, this is a work from Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers, that the richer people are, the happier they are, though not that much. Money buys a little bit of happiness, not much, but a little bit. So is there really anything to be said in favor of capitalism, socialism? Didn't we just have this debate in the 20th century? Don't the facts just speak for themselves? Isn't it just over? Well, not really, because I think a very common reaction to these kinds of data is that, sure, maybe it works out, but nevertheless, there's still something morally good about socialism. There's still something morally superior about it. The reason socialism doesn't work and hasn't succeeded worldwide is because, well, frankly, you are not very good, and me neither. We human beings are jerks. So what socialism asked of people was couldn't we just all get together and work together collectively towards everyone's common good? In order to make that work, what we need is for everybody to work for the benefit of all, not necessarily demanding any kind of special reward for yourself. And then when we try that, what happens is people are kind of lazy and slack off and don't really add much. Imagine, just to illustrate, imagine you were in a classroom, Econ 101, and I'm your professor, and it's this size class. And I say, here's the deal, I'm an egalitarian, so 15 weeks from now, I'm going to give you a final exam worth 100% of your grade for this class. But I'm not going to give you your score and you your score. Rather, I'm going to average all of your scores together, and you're all going to get the same grade. How much would you study? Hear a lot of laughter. You probably wouldn't, right? So by changing the rules, I make you all kind of slack off, because you're probably thinking, if I put in a lot of work, I expect other people to slack off. What's the point? I don't want to be a sucker. I'll just binge watch Netflix. In fact, economists have actually done this as an experiment, and the result is you get an average grade of an F. You make smart people go to failing simply by changing the rules. But that's only because you don't really trust each other to put in the effort. You kind of think, I think everyone else will slack off. Or some of you are like, oh, awesome. If I'm in a big group, I can free ride on everybody else. But that's a problem with us. If we were good people, we wouldn't do that, right? If I knew you were good and you knew I were good, we wouldn't do that. I would know you do your part, you know I do my part. I could trust you to study, you could trust me to study, and we get an A, but we don't. The other thing that tends to happen is, when you try to instantiate socialism on a national scale, we don't really know how to make it work as a kind of anarchist collective. That works fine for small societies of 100 people, but we don't know how to make that work on the scale of 100 million. So we end up having some sort of representative of the people that gets the power over the economy. And that person or the group is supposed to use that power for everybody's benefit. But historically, they don't. Historically, you can think of it there's a competition between the nice people for the power and the mean people for the power. And the nice people, being nice, will only do scrupulous things to try to get that power. And the mean people, being mean, will do whatever it takes to get it. And they sort of have an advantage in the way that the dark side of the force has an advantage over the light side of the force. And so when we create this power, which is supposed to be used to promote the common good, we don't get benevolent dictators who are running the economy for everybody. We get a Pol Pot or a Stalin or Mao, mass murderer psychopaths. So nevertheless, that's a problem with us. If only we were good, if only we were angels, that kind of stuff wouldn't happen, right? If I had waved a magic wand and made you all perfectly virtuous, then if I created that much power, You'd be nice, and you wouldn't try to seize the power for evil ends. You'd be just like these nice people over here, and only good things would happen. So because of that, here's what tends to happen. People tend to think the following. Okay, capitalism of some sort works pretty well with selfish human beings like you. And you all are very selfish. I know this about you, because I've been to Boulder before, and I did a poll, right? I come to Boulder like every April somehow. Like right when the tulips are blooming, I come. Though I guess you're throwing a snowstorm at me tomorrow. I have to get out quickly. All right? So here's something I know. Like how many, let me ask a question. I already know what the answer is. How many of you have donated a kidney to save a stranger's life? No? No one. No one ever has, right? And you could, especially if you're a younger person, you could totally do that at no long-term cost to your health, but you don't because you don't really care that much. You're willing to let people die. Right? So you're kind of selfish people, and me too. I didn't do it when I was 20 either. Right? I'm just like you. Right? So capitalism, what it does is it takes selfish people like you and me, and it gives us an incentive to work for one another's benefit. Right? Like why do I grade my students' papers? What's my motivation when I do that? They're not here, so we can be brutally honest. What's that? Yeah, I mean, basically because I get paid to do it, right? You know, if the university came to me tomorrow and said, we're not paying you to grade papers, I'd be like, all right, I'm not doing it anymore. All right, some of the stuff I do for my job I might do for free, but maybe not as much of it, you know? So I'm just kind of a selfish person. I serve other people, but for money. Right? When I go to like Starbucks, they have coffee waiting for me. It's so wonderful, but they don't do it because they like me. When I go to the guitar store, which I do way too often, they have a wide variety of awesome guitars and basses and amplifiers for me to choose from, but none of those people, like Randy Smith, the founder of Mesa Boogie, he's not doing it because he likes me. He's doing it because he wants my money, right? And you too. We're all working for each other's benefit, but only in exchange for our own self-interest. And so many people think, well, capitalism is a system that takes selfish people like you and gets them to work together. Socialism is a system that takes virtuous, altruistic, caring people and asks them to work together. And the reason socialism hasn't worked in the real world is because we're just not very caring and not very virtuous and not very kind. If you think that, then you end up coming to this conclusion that, well, socialism is kind of better than capitalism. Socialism is a good system for good people, but maybe a bad system for bad people. Capitalism is a good system for bad people like you, but if we were good, we wouldn't need it. It's a pretty reasonable thought. And it turns out it's not just socialists who say this. It's actually, you read like libertarian thought and classical liberal thought and like the typical capitalist economist, they say the exact same thing. You know, the great kind of capitalist philosopher David Hume, he says, you know, if everyone were perfectly altruistic, we'd have no need for private property and everything would be kind of like owned by everyone and no one. Adam Smith says, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher that I expect to get meat, but with regard to his own self-interest. And most economic arguments for the existence of private property are based upon the assumption that if you keep things in the commons, people will overuse it and destroy it, so we have to parcel it out to prevent that kind of crappy behavior. So maybe the best exponent of this view, you might not have heard of him unless you're a philosophy student, or philosophy major, or philosophy professor, is the Marxist philosopher Jerry Cohen. Jerry Cohen was the Shishela Chair at the University of Oxford, and he wrote this book, Why Not Socialism? You can see that I based my cover on his, like that's his cover, here's my cover, more and healthier and happier flowers. We actually tried making the colors gold and black, which are anarcho-capitalist colors, because those are revolutionary Marxist colors, but it looked goofy, so we switched it back to red. So this is replete with symbolism, and if you read the book, there's some talks about letting many flowers bloom and quoting Mao against Mao and so on. So Jerry Cohen is a socialist philosopher, but he's a weird kind of socialist Marxist philosopher, because at the end of his life, this is what he says. Bourgeois economics is basically sound. By bourgeois economics, he just means economics, like what they teach in econ departments. He actually rejected Marxian economics at the end of his life. He's like, yeah, they're basically right about how the economy works. Marx is probably wrong about that. But Marx, contrary to what Marx thinks of himself, Marx saw himself as a social scientist. Cohen says, no, Marx is a moral philosopher, and his moral argument for socialism is what's good. Marx is right that socialism is a better system, and Cohen wants to show you in this book that deep down, you're already a socialist. And I know we're hanging out in Boulder, and people call the People's Republic of Boulder, so maybe that's not as big, tall an order, but I've actually given a version of this talk at like places like the Heritage Institute, and it turns out they all say the same thing, right? Like even at very conservative places, this is what they seem to have, these intuitions that lead them to the idea that socialism is best. So here's how Cohen wants to illustrate that, with a thought experiment. Philosophers do love their thought experiments. He says, I want you to imagine that you go on a camping trip with your best friends, people that you truly, genuinely love and who truly and genuinely love you. Because you so deeply care about one another, you want to make sure everyone has a good time and also an equally good time. There's no sort of Cartman of your group that gets kind of pushed to the side and treated a little bit worse than everybody else. You can make sure that like everyone has a good time, and also like the burdens of working together and being together in a camp, like having to clean up some filth and the trash and all that, we're going to share that equally. We're not going to be like, sorry, you're like the least popular friend, so we're going to make you clean up the trash. We're going to instead share the burdens equally. Now, when people show up camping, they bring different things. Some people might bring a tent or a fishing pole. Someone always brings a guitar so they can play Oasis and sing that stupid Wonderwall song. I don't do that, by the way. That's not me. We bring stuff separately, but because we care about each other, we make it like a common bounty that anyone can use at will. And also, because we care about each other, when other people share their stuff equally, you don't take advantage of it and start using it like for your own benefit at their expense. You don't overuse it. That sounds pretty wonderful. It sounds like a pretty good camping trip. I don't personally like camping that much, and Cohen apparently hated it, but it sounds pretty good. Cohen then says, I want you to imagine the camping trip goes bad. I want you to start imagining that people behave on this camping trip the way they behave in actual real-life capitalist societies. So one person, let's say his name's Steve, is like, hey guys, I'm really good at catching fish, and I'm willing to catch extra fish so we can all eat better tonight, but only if I don't have to do the crummy chores. All right? Otherwise, I'm just not going to use my talents for your benefit. So Steve here might be like Steve Jobs, who only does stuff because he gets paid, perhaps. Right? Maybe there's another person named Morgan, and Morgan is really good at cracking nuts, and he's willing to teach the rest of us how to crack nuts so we can all have more nuts to eat. This is one of his examples, not mine. But Morgan's like, I'm only willing to teach the rest of you how to crack nuts if I kind of get more food than everybody else. So in this example, Morgan's kind of like a college professor. I don't show up for free. Maybe there's another person who knows where there's a good fishing spot, and he's willing to tell us, but again, only if he gets paid more. And finally, maybe there's one other person, it's called Michael, who his dad came to that camping spot 30 years before and stocked a pond full of fish and told Michael where it is. So at dinner that night, when the rest of us are eating, Michael has a plate just overflowing with extra fish. And he just kind of sits there and is like, ha ha, I have more fish than the rest of you. Which is sort of like what you see in capitalist societies where people consume status goods like Swiss watches, right? Or I could pick on you and point out your fancy stuff. Yeah, all that stuff, right? So that doesn't sound very good. Cohen asks the following question. Would you prefer to go on that camping trip or this one? How many people would prefer to go on this camping trip? Pretty much everybody. How many people would prefer to go on this camping trip? A couple people, all right? I've asked this question, I've given this talk to lots of different people, really left-wing groups, really right-wing groups, everything in between. Even when I'm talking to a bunch of anarcho-capitalist people and hardcore libertarians or really right-wing conservative people, they all prefer the socialist camping trip. So Cohen's like, aha, in your mind, in your heart, you would prefer to live like this. So then what's wrong with that? So Cohen asks, is there any reason why it wouldn't be desirable to make the whole world like that camping trip? Leave aside for the second question of whether we can do it. Just ask if it's desirable. Because lots of things are desirable that can't be done. For instance, the Force from Star Wars. Wouldn't you love to have the Force? I'd love to have the Force, telekinesis and light. I would join the dark side because they have the lightning, right? But I had a professor in college, Larry Krauss, who wrote a book about the physics of Star Trek, beyond Star Trek, and he said that the Force is incompatible with our physics, so we're never going to discover telekinetic force powers. It's a real bummer. But it would still be desirable. If I could cure AIDS and cancer with a snap of my fingers, it would be desirable for me to do so. I just can't. There's no physics laws that make that possible. Lots of things are desirable even if they're not attainable. So there's a story, I guess it comes from Russia, of a fox, and he smells some grapes up on a tree, and given his keen sense of smell, he recognizes these are the best grapes anywhere, the tastiest grapes there could ever be. But he jumps over and over again trying to reach the grapes, and he never reaches them because they're out of reach. And then the fox says, they're probably sour anyways. What's the fox's mistake? Well, the fact that the grapes are out of reach doesn't make them any less tasty. It just means you can't get them. For Cohen, socialism is kind of like the grapes. Maybe it's unobtainable because we're jerks, but that's too bad. They're still good. Now, Cohen says there's really two barriers to socialism working. One is a motivational thing. You aren't nice enough. There's also an informational problem, which I won't get too into, that says that it turns out it's a finding in economics that you can't get mass cooperation without using something like a price as a signal of the scarcity of an item, and we don't know how to substitute that on a mass scale. Cohen, despite being a Marxist, says, I read this stuff, the bourgeois economists are right about that. So he says even his ideal society is going to end up being what he calls market socialism, not straight up socialism. But he says, their main impediment is human motivation. We're just not very nice. So it turns out everyone's a socialist, QED. Or maybe not. What I'm going to do now is parody his argument. I'm going to make the exact same argument the other way and try to argue deep down you're all a bunch of capitalists and socialism is really bad. Just using the exact same argument he did, but switching the words. If you read the book, I literally take chunks out of his book and switch some of the words around, and thanks to fair use laws, it's okay for me to do that. But it's a parody. So my parody involves the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse on Disney XD. Because I realized a few years ago, there's something wrong with what his argument is. I just need an illustration. And I was watching this with my, at the time, 1-year-old, and aha, there it is. So this is the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse TV show. It's not the Mickey Mouse Club from the 1950s with Annette Funicello and so on. It's a cartoon with these anthropomorphic animals, and they live together in some sort of village, right? They're also robustly capitalist. So Clarabelle Cow, pictured there, owns a sundry store called the Moo Mart and a factory called the Moo Muffin Factory, where she produces things that she sells for money, for profit. Minnie, pictured there, owns a bow-making factory and a bow store called the Boutique. Get it? Right? And she routinely sells bows for profit. Willie, pictured there, Willie the Giant, is a bourgeois capitalist landowner who owns a massive farm where he grows crops and sells them for money. Donald Duck has a smaller farm. Professor Von Drake has some sort of advanced nanotech machinery which he uses to manufacture various goods, and sometimes he sells them and sometimes he gives it away. They live together in peace, harmony, and prosperity. Nothing bad ever happens from a moral point of view, except, just to be real precise, the character Pete sometimes acts like a jerk, but you could write him out of the story. He's not sort of incidental. When bad things happen, they work together to overcome them, like if a ball won't stop bouncing, or if Gooey Goo spills on people and turns them into babies, or if there's 5 copies of Goofy made, they work together to overcome these problems. Some of the things they do collectively, the Piers of the Roads are collectively owned, and there's an amphitheater that's collectively owned, but they also have robust private property, not just in personal items, but in the means of production, and they buy and sell things on markets. There's no exploitation, there's no harm, and further, they live by a number of highfalutin moral principles. They live by a principle of social justice, by which they make sure that everyone gets what they need, and no one falls through the crack. Now, in our anti-social mean society, we try to achieve that through taxation and redistribution. But because they're so morally virtuous, they don't have any government at all, and they don't need to do government redistribution. They just give people what they need and coordinate without government. They respect one another's rights, but they do so without any kind of enforcement. They don't have police. They are anarchist, right? They're so virtuous they don't need government at all. They live on principles of beneficence where they work towards one another's benefit. They live on principles of mutual reciprocity where I serve you and you serve me in turn, right? They work on principles of tolerance. They're very open-minded and accepting of difference, and they celebrate the differences in one another. So, for example, we've had a massive history of racism in our society, but Goofy Dog and Clarabelle Cow are a thing and no one bats an eye at it. Right? So from a moral point of view and from a socialist point of view, you can't really look at their capitalist society and say there's anything wrong with it. You're just like, yeah, it's fine. The things I don't like about capitalism just don't happen there. But I want you to imagine the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse village becomes socialist. And they start behaving the way that real-life socialist societies have behaved. So imagine Mickey Mouse installs himself as premier and starts to instantiate some sort of economic dictatorship plan of 5-year plans. But they don't work, and so the standard of living is stagnant over 5 years. Imagine that, in order to make this plan work, he has to seize the farmland from Willie the Giant and all these other people who don't want to give up their farmland. So he just kills them. And there's a region in Mickey Mouse Clubhouse world, we'll call it Ukraine, where he just starves all of them. All of them. Imagine that they recognize that a lot of people disagree with their plan, because even though a bunch of people are socialists now, they disagree about the right form of socialism, and they don't all go along with this plan. So Mickey Mouse says, you know what, anyone who's educated, anyone who's an intellectual, I'm going to declare them an enemy in the state and kill them, and he ends up killing 20% of the population. Suppose that dissidents and others are thrown into gulags where the conditions are so horrible that people will purposefully cut off their arms and legs so they can rot in a hospital rather than die in the mines. And the only people that flourish there are criminal organizations that have been sort of, they're glad because they like rape nuns and things like that. We probably wouldn't let our kids watch that show. So I guess I'd ask you, which society would you prefer to live in? This one? Or who prefers this one? All right? Maybe if you're like the dictator, you would. I don't know. So, you're all capitalist. Now, if you were a socialist, you'd probably be like, oh, wait a minute. That's not fair, right? When I'm complaining about capitalism, I'm not complaining about that. And when I advocate socialism, I'm not advocating that, right? I hope not. I mean, if you are, you're a jerk. Don't do that. Quit it. But this is not what people have in mind. When Bernie Sanders is like, I'm a socialist, he doesn't use that word correctly, but when he says he's a socialist, he's not talking about defending this. And when he's complaining about capitalism, he's not complaining about that. That's true, but it's also the case that when people are criticizing socialism in the real world, they're not criticizing this. And when they're defending capitalism, they're not defending that either. So what's going on here? Here's what's really going with Jerry Cohen's argument. He made a kind of mistake. What he did was he said, I want you to imagine a socialist society with perfectly virtuous people. So I'm changing, and then compare that to a capitalist society with people of realistic levels of virtue. Kind of meh. Not horrible, but not great. And then he's like, which do you prefer? And everyone's like, I prefer the socialist society with perfect angels to realistic capitalism. And he's like, aha, you must all be socialists then. But the problem here is you're manipulating two variables at once. You're changing two morally significant things. One is the kind of economic organization that you have, and the other is the degree of virtue that you're specifying in people, right? It'd be like if I said, I've often been known as being critical of some of the things that happen in modern democracies, but imagine I write a book where I criticize democracy, and then I go, what we really should have is Queen Elsa, after she gets her ice powers together, from Arendelle. She's awesome. Wouldn't it be better to have Queen Elsa than Donald Trump? Who thinks so? Almost everybody. Aha! You're all in favor of monarchy over democracy. Well, not really. You just like monarchy with a really awesome queen compared to democracy with that guy, right? So you're manipulating two variables at once, the kind of economic organization and the degree of virtue. So what he really should have done was compare ideal capitalism to ideal socialism, like capitalism plus angels to socialism plus angels, which is better, if either, maybe neither is. And also realistic capitalism to realistic socialism. Oddly, Cohen kind of admits, he's like, I guess at the end of the day, I think realistic capitalism probably beats realistic socialism because people are such jerks. But nevertheless, socialism is still the ideal. If people were perfectly virtuous, they would be socialist. So I realized this was a problem way back, towards the end of his life. I emailed him a little bit about this stuff, and one of the things he said was yeah, I guess that's an issue, but I'm not sure what ideal capitalism would even look like, right? And at the time, I'm like, I don't really know either. I'm not going to say Galt's Gulch from Ayn Rand's novel, because those people are all selfish and mean, and that's disagreeing about morality. But then I watched this show, and I was like, aha, that's it right there. That's it. So in reality, the problem is, ideal socialism beats real capitalism, but so what? Maybe ideal capitalism beats real socialism, but so what? We have to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges. So at this point, we don't really know which is better. If people were perfectly virtuous, what kind of economic organization would they have? So now what I'm going to do is, even though the argument I just made for capitalism is a fallacious argument, it's literally the same fallacy that Jerry Cohen committed, I'm just doing it as a parody, I want to argue that when we think about what went wrong with his argument and what went wrong with my argument, and then we think a little bit more about Utopia, that actually, if I had a magic wand, I'm going to make this the magic wand, if I wave this Shure 58A, I have a couple of these at home, but not wireless ones, if I wave this wand, it will make you all perfectly virtuous. What kind of economic organization we have? I'm going to argue it'd be mostly capitalist. That capitalism is not just a pretty good system that works okay, though it has a lot of flaws with mean people like you, but that if you were angels, you'd still be capitalist. So to do that, I have to have you imagine something. A world like ours, where it has the same laws of nature, And human beings are mostly the same. No one has any superpowers. They're not smarter or stronger or faster. They have the same kind of level of ability that you have. But I take everybody's morality meter and I turn it all the way up. Everyone is like perfectly virtuous. No one has any degree of moral flaws whatsoever. To then show that kind of society would be some form of capitalism, if you don't like the word capitalism, and that was meant to be a pejorative, just say market society or whatever, I'd have to give you some reason why they would have private property even in this world of angels, and why they would want to use markets even in this world of angels. So what could those arguments be? And I can't rely upon many commonplace arguments that economists make. So if you ask economists why we have private property, one of their arguments will be, oh, that's simple. If everything is held collectively, then people will overuse it and destroy it. So we have to parcel and privatize it. That's the problem. So that's one reason for private property. It turns out you can avoid private property like in small scale groups. If you read the work of Elinor Ostrom, first woman to win a Nobel Prize in economics, she has a lot to say about when you don't need to privatize. But on a mass scale, you do. All right, that's the kind of common sense argument from economists. But I can't use that argument because I'm imagining people are perfectly virtuous and they know everyone else is perfectly virtuous. Yeah, that's right. They wouldn't overuse it. Exactly. So what are property rights? At first glance, they're kind of weird things. When you think about what a property right is, it's actually a collection of rights, right? So I have a car, like this is actually in Washington, D.C. right now. I have a car at like Dulles Airport. What does it mean for me to own that car? It's a bundle of rights. The weird part of it is that there's this piece of the universe that I'm allowed to exclude the rest of you from. I own my house. That means there's this place in Northern Virginia that I'm allowed to exclude the rest of you from. You're just not allowed to go to that piece of the universe without my permission. That's weird. What could possibly justify that? Excluding other people from parts of the universe? It also means that, generally speaking, you can modify that thing. Like if I want to take my car, it's white, and paint like purple polka dots on it, I am free to do so. It wouldn't look good, but I could. If I want to destroy the car, I'm free to do so. I could just get a baseball bat and start smashing the windows, and it's within my rights to do that. If I wanted to sell the car to somebody else, I'm free to do so. If I wanted to rent it for money, I'm free to do so. If I want to modify in various ways, I'm free to do so. Now, we don't own everything the same way. Like I also own a little puppy now. We got her 2 weeks ago. Her name's Zoe. She's really cute. I don't have any pictures. Sorry about that. I'm not allowed to like sell her, modify her, paint her with polka dots, etc., the way I am to my car, but I still have ownership over her, which gives me some rights, including rights of exclusion. Like I can be like, if I had Zoe here, you would totally want to pet her, and it would be within my right to be like, nope. And you'd be like, why? What could possibly justify that? So that's what property rights are. They're the central right of a property right is the right to exclude other people from a piece of the universe, and then it usually comes with other rights about use and so on. It also comes with certain duties, like you have an obligation to me not to come like mess up my house. You have an obligation not to drive my car. If you damage that stuff, you're supposed to pay me. So like if I come up to my car and smash it with a baseball bat, that's totally fine, but if you scratch it just a little bit, you're supposed to compensate me. What could justify these rights? So what might be any reasons to have private property even in Utopia? Well, I'm going to basically borrow some arguments for Jerry Cohen. Because Cohen actually believes that even in Utopia, in socialist Utopia, you'd still have private property over certain things. He thinks it'd be okay for you to own your own house as long as you don't rent it or sell it for extra money. You can have a car as long as you don't drive it like as a taxi or for Uber. You can have a guitar the way I do, where I totally lose lots of money on it, but you can't have a guitar the way that like John Petrucci does or Eddie Van Halen, where they make money on it. Right? You can have personal property in socialist utopia. You just can't have private property in the means of production. So why does Cohen say that? He says, well, there's some reasons. Basically, we're living in a material world, and I'm a material girl. That's the reason, right? We're not disembodied minds. For us to be happy, for most human beings, you need to have sustained access to certain goods over time. Right? So I have my guitar collection and my amplifiers. I don't really need that much of it, but I do need some of it to be happy. And I need to know that when I come back and when I go back to my house tomorrow, that it's not messed up. It's the way that I left it. I got all the settings just right. I got everything configured just right. I want it to be there the way that I left it in my tuning range, the way that I have it. Right? If all this stuff were collectively owned, I wouldn't have as much sort of joy from it. It would be kind of a pain. And then I have to figure out when we're going to share it and sign up for access to it. The transaction costs would be really high, and it'd be very alienating. People need to have some things that are their own. Cohen completely agrees with that. He also says, to be at home in the world means having spaces that you can kind of make to your own vision. Right? Imagine if every single house, the decoration in your house were decided collectively by the entire country all at once. Right, so we're going to decorate like your house, and we're going to vote like what goes in your bathroom. I guess like seashells would win. People seem to like to put seashells in their bathrooms. I don't know how you decorate your bathroom, but I'm guessing you don't have seashells. You wouldn't like that, right? So we want to have these spaces that are our own. We can decide individually. So that seems right, but then I asked Cohen, well, why not apply that also to productive property? So take Jerry Cohen when he goes to do his work. When he sits down to write a paper, he doesn't do socialist writing, he does individualistic writing. It's not like he's like, I'm gonna write a paper and it should be written collectively by everyone in the profession, so let's have a collective vote about what the paper will be about. Bummer, it's about unrestricted Mariology. I don't even care about that topic. All right, what's the first word? We voted, it's the. He would hate that. All right? Imagine if you're a painter, and every time you sit down to paint, you have to go, all right, what are we going to paint today? Oh, another Thomas Kincaid landscape, great. All right, I wanted to make it like a Matisse-style abstract thing, but I guess it's going to be another. What's the first, where should I do? Brown over here to begin with, short stroke with this number 7 brush. People would hate that. If you understand like why painters don't want to do all their painting socialist style, and if you understand why professors don't want to do all their writing socialist style, maybe you can understand why someone might want to own a farm and have their own vision of how to run things and like try that out for themselves. Or they might want to own like one of the shops downtown and like try out their own idea of like how to sell something. You can understand why Minnie Mouse, it's not enough for her that she works in the collective bow factory and the collective bow company, but that she has her own bow company where she can try out her own vision. Right? So I see like, and some of the things like socialists would point to, but that they hate about capitalism, like exploitation, inequality, and so on, those might be problems of real-life capitalism. And by the way, they're also problems of real-life socialism. But these things just don't happen in utopian capitalism because by hypothesis, people are too nice. Beyond that, also like asking permission for everything, everything's collectively owned, it's oppressive. Like when my wife and kids leave the house, I'm like, oh, freedom. And it's not like because I'm like, oh, I can finally break out the heroin that they don't know about, right? It's just like being able to have a time when like I can do whatever I want without having to be worried about other people. Right? Even though I love those people a lot. I'm a selfish jerk, but I love them more than I love me. It's like them, me, everybody else, right? So even then, like having to make everything collective is sort of oppressive. People want private property in these things. And Cohen accepts all of this except for in the means of production, but he doesn't seem to have a good reason not to. What about reasons for markets? There's a couple of reasons. One is that you making decisions about how you're going to live your life is part of what makes you the author of your own life. This is why Cohen is a liberal socialist and not like an authoritarian socialist. He says it's important that you be able to choose your own religion or lack thereof. You be able to choose with whom you associate or don't associate with. That you choose like what kinds of music you listen to and what you consume and like what you do with your Tuesday afternoons and so on. Because that's part of what makes you the author of your own life. So to Cohen, we might say, well, what about making economic decisions? Whether I decide to like put new siding on the house or invest it in like my retirement and retire early, or whether I decide to, prioritize traveling over things for my kids, or put money into guitars instead of money into other stuff. And shouldn't I be the author of that stuff as well? Now, in real life capitalism, if we give people freedom to do that, they might do mean things with it. They might be callous towards the poor. They might use that money in exploitative ways, and that's a bummer. And it's also true in real life socialism, people do that. But again, in utopian capitalism, by hypothesis, people being virtuous wouldn't. But there's one other final reason why they would want to use markets, and that's because markets serve the common good. So to illustrate that, I have a different magic wand. When I wave this magic wand, it will make everyone on Earth 30 times richer. I picked that number because GDP per capita worldwide is about 30 times higher than it was 1,000 years ago. Right? So when I wave this magic wand, everyone becomes 30 times richer. Jerry Cohen would say you should totally wave that magic wand because money and wealth are freedom. Jerry Cohen said, like the Marxist philosopher says, this stuff in my wallet, cash, these are tickets. That's what this really is. It's tickets. It's freedom. The more of this you have, and really the real wealth that it represents, the more power you have to live a life that's authentically yours, to do what pleases you, to be who you really are. If I'd been born into like my circumstances in Lowell, Massachusetts, or was born like 1905, I'd have been like a textile worker. I wouldn't get to be like a professor for a living, which is much more authentic to me. So unfortunately, we don't have a magic wand. But what if instead we had a brilliant philosopher queen? And this brilliant philosopher queen comes up with an economic plan. What she does is she figures out if we all work together a certain way, we can become 30 times richer over time. But I'm not going to be an oppressive queen, so I'm going to give everybody an option. You can either be a mortician or a medical doctor, and you can either be an auto mechanic or a tomato farmer, and you can either be a guitar maker, manufacturer, luthier, that's what they're called. I shouldn't say that very quickly because I get good. You can be a luthier or you can be a radio DJ. And she gives you all a couple options that you can choose from. Cohen would say if we were perfectly virtuous, we would all voluntarily go along with her plan because we care about strangers and we want their lives to go better. But the problem is there will never be any such philosopher queen because human beings are too stupid. And that's one of the findings in economics is that you just can't have planning on that mass scale like with just a few people. You need to have some sort of mechanism that tells people about relative scarcity and relative need. And the only mechanism we know about today that works are market prices. Cohen accepts that, so he admits no philosophy queen will ever be in the offering. But the nice thing then is that we have a fairly decent substitute. Thank you. We have a fairly decent substitute for the philosopher queen, which are the forces of supply and demand on the market. They work in kind of the same way. So Mickey Mouse, knowing that there are distant strangers on the other side of the world, will be like, oh, I want to participate in market society, in part because I know this will have the tendency to enrich strangers that I'll never meet. That's true even in real-life capitalism with all its manifest flaws, full of bad people like you. It's going to be even more true in utopian capitalism with perfectly virtuous people like a Mickey Mouse in that show. One final argument, which is, which would you choose? If you could choose, how many of you would choose Cohen's Utopia over Mickey Mouse Utopia? So how many of you would prefer to live in Cohen's camping trip for the rest of your life? Okay, how many of you, one person, how many of you, if you could, would choose to live in the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse Village, though let's imagine if you want, you don't have to, people instead of anthropomorphic animals? Even here in Boulder, Colorado, despite like the reputation, almost everyone says that. In fact, I've asked this question to like I've been like in front of really hardcore left-wing groups, and almost everyone chooses the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse world over Cohen's socialist utopia, which is telling. Most people would pick that over that if they could. But it's actually a trick question because capitalism doesn't make you choose, and that's one reason why it's better. So Cohen's idea of utopia is basically like the Mona Lisa, and really utopia is like the entire lieu. I never say that properly because I didn't take French. The capitalist utopia that the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse is in allows for socialism within it. If the Smurfs want to move in and have a little Smurf commune, the Smurfs are communist, right? Papa Smurf looks like Karl Marx on purpose. Right? He has red, right? That's all on purpose. It's not accidental symbolism. It's all on purpose. They have a little socialist commune, like within the greater capitalist superstructure. That's totally permissible. And in fact, even in crummy real-life capitalist societies, we have that kind of thing. Like I live myself in a small communist society. Right? And we're not all perfectly equal. There are 4 people live in my communist society plus an 11-week-old puppy. Right? And 2 of the people kind of outrank the other 2 people, and the puppy's down there. But like between the 2 people, it's all collectively owned. But we're a closed socialist society. Like you're not admitted equally the way that like my wife and I are in my small socialist society. So this is important because when people talk about utopia, this is a problem, they often like kind of imagine what's utopia for them. And it's interesting here because Jerry Cohen, his first book that really took off was a critique of the philosopher Robert Nozick. And Nozick said in the book Anarchy, State, and Utopia that the thing is there's massive diversity among people. The best possible society for you is different from the best society for you and is different from the best society for you. What we really would want, ideally, would be a situation in which there are lots of different kinds of societies and you could freely choose which one you enter into. And so I think when we reflect on what Cohen's done, though it wasn't his intention, he's actually helped us see that maybe Nozick was right about that. What we might want is something like an overall Mickey Mouse Clubhouse-style capitalist superstructure, which allows for non-capitalist societies within it. My utopia might be something like a less congested version of Northern Virginia, where we race our cool cars around all day and then play heavy metal concerts at night. Yours might be a small Christian fishing village where everyone has a traditional lifestyle. Yours might be like a kind of Hutterite-style commune. Yours might be a kind of Israeli-style kibbutzim. Yours might be Boulder, Colorado. I guess maybe Jerry Cohen's was living in kind of mostly capitalist Oxford, England, but spending all his time talking about how awesome socialism is. So it's a trick question. Capitalism doesn't make you choose, and that's one reason why it might be better. So I think Cohen is right. Ideal socialism is indeed better than realistic capitalism. I'd rather live in a socialist society full of angels than in the real world. But that doesn't tell us much. At the end of the day, he actually admits he thinks that realistic capitalism beats realistic socialism. Maybe you don't agree with that, and I haven't really argued for it. But he thinks it does. So I think realistic capitalism beats realistic socialism, and I've given you an argument about why ideal capitalism also beats ideal socialism, and oddly, one reason it beats it is because for some people it doesn't, paradoxically. So in the real world, capitalism induces selfish people like you or others to provide products and services at a price that you're willing to pay. It's a pretty good thing. In an ideal world full of angels, capitalism would allow you to give a chance at having your own personal utopia, and that's why it's better. So with that, thanks, and I'll take your questions and comments.
So I got the task of leading the discussion tonight. Let me apologize again, especially for anyone who came in late, that this isn't the debate that we were hoping it would be, but I trust that, as I knew you would, you found Professor Brennan thoroughly engaging. Okay, and I hope that we can have some discussion now at this point and some pushback from the audience. I'm counting on all of you to provide that sort of thing. Why don't we start back there in the black and gold? Talk into the microphone if you would, because then we'll get it on the video recording.
So thank you for that. That was pretty nice. So one of the two basics or foundation stones that you based your argument on was that essentially, if it was left to a collective, then we'd slack off and you wouldn't do it. And that's kind of a pervasive argument that's thrown around. And I guess there is a lot of evidence for that as well. But also, having said that, if you take into account what people do once they do accumulate their wealth or the discretionary wealth, it's always, there is, I don't know, any sentient being has this kind of impetus to do something with it. And couldn't you just argue that it's a failure of the way we value things, or we ascribe value to certain things, that whatever we do from 5 to 9 is not exactly touted as productive as 9 to 5, even though that may be the stuff that actually drives the economy in reality. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, I guess a mixture of both or within whatever co-opted capitalism that is. And you also mentioned the Gini coefficient going down, but we've come to the state where wealth just generates wealth by virtue of having wealth, and there is no need for any effort. So that again goes back to the same point with respect to capital can be generated just because you have capital, and you can slack off and still generate capital, and that's clearly what's broken.
Yeah.
So
okay, good. Yeah, a lot of stuff there. So regarding the stuff with regard to productivity, this is one of the sort of puzzles about a capitalist society and like a socialist society. And it's the thing that like Cohen would have to worry about too. So Cohen says, one worry is that if you were just free to do whatever you want, you might choose to do something that isn't very useful to other people. Like, it hurts me to say this, but it turns out people aren't willing to pay me that much to like play rock music for them. For what it's worth, they're willing to pay me a little bit, but far less than they're willing to pay me to like write books at Georgetown. Like, mass difference. So, we need these sort of economic incentives. In the real world, with like selfish people like me, we need these economic incentives perhaps to get me to do like what's more useful to people. I often ask I teach mostly business students. I work in a business school, and I'll often ask them, especially if I have like a first-year undergraduate class, how many of you would major in something else if there weren't any salary premium that came from like majoring in finance and accounting? And the number's actually been going down. More and more people say they just want to do it for its own sake, but there's still a fair number of people that are like, oh yeah, if I could make as much money studying classics, I totally would. So, even in a socialist society, this is an issue. We have to get people to do what's most useful. And so prices in the real world help give you information about what is useful to other people and what's not. And that's a problem that has to be solved. So that's an issue. Now, as far as like capital generating capital, there's a lot to be said for that. I'm not going to try to convince you of one thing or another, because if you read like Piketty or something, there's queries about like maybe this is going to just be runaway inequality in the future. Even if it's not showing up on my graph now, it might show up in the future. There is to be said, though, we do actually want, and I think even if you're a socialist philosopher, you want to say this, we do actually want capital to generate capital. That's part of the point of capital. When you think about why is it we're so much richer than we were 1,000 years ago, GDP per capita in England in the year 1000 AD was about $1,000. Nice little parallel. Today it's around like $44,000 in real terms. Real growth. Why are we so much richer and the rest of us are better off? It's because of capital accumulation. It's because a lot of that stuff was allowed to grow and then it's invested in new things, right? So that makes us richer. Like one of the jobs I had to take some time off from college to like go work in a factory to like pay for my final year of college. And I had a job where this is what I did all day. I'll act it out for you. 20 minutes later, do the same thing. I got paid $17 an hour to do that. How could I make $17 an hour doing that? Which makes me, when I earned $17 an hour, that put me in the top 1% of income earners worldwide in history. Right? That's amazing. How could I make that much money doing that? It's because in front of me was a $4 million implant machine which shot ions into silicon. So we want capital accumulation. I think your question is just, what's sort of the best distribution of income and wealth, and how do we make sure, in particular, that people don't fall behind? I personally am not much of an economic egalitarian. I think egalitarianism misses the point of social justice. I don't think social justice is about making us equal. I think it's about making sure that everybody has sufficiently enough to lead a good and authentic life for themselves. Beyond that, equality doesn't inherently matter, right? But you might disagree. So that's a good question, how to think about the issues of inequality. But I do want to say capital accumulation is in itself a very important thing.
So my question is, you're talking about the perfectly virtuous capitalist versus the perfectly virtuous socialist. Does it matter what version of virtue you're talking about? Are we talking about Kantians? Are we talking about utilitarians? Are we talking about Aristotelians? Or does it matter?
Yeah, that's a good question. For this argument, I just basically said whatever Cohen thinks. You know, whatever his view is, I'm just insert that. I honestly don't know like what the correct moral theory is. I actually don't think high-level moral theories are very useful. I think we can dispense with them. I think moral knowledge mostly consists of mid-level principles and asking. I wrote a dissertation on this. I can go on this for a long period of time, but all right, awesome. My view is like asking what Kantianism says about day-to-day life is like what asking what Einstein's field equations say about the path of that paper when it fell, and which is the answer is not much. It's all intermediate physics that explains that. So Cohen has certain moral intuitions about social justice, about caring, about so on, and I basically grant him almost all of that, with a few exceptions. He ends up being a really hardcore egalitarian in a way that I think he can't sustain with his liberal. He wants to be a liberal, he wants to be an egalitarian, but he's such a hardcore egalitarian they come into conflict. So he says, I can't allow you to have $100 extra more than me, because if you're even that much richer than me, our lives won't be sufficiently similar that you'll be able to empathize with me perfectly, and we won't be in perfect community. $100 would do it, according to Cohen. If he says that, it's not clear to me how he could allow diversity of religion, diversity of thought, diversity of musical tastes. Like, you having $100 more than me doesn't bother me that much, but if I find out that you really hate Dream Theater and you hate Opeth, like, that's going to bug me a lot more, right? So I think he can't be that egalitarian. So there are a couple moral principles that he has that I don't think he can sustain. But beyond that, I basically want to just give him his moral theory and then apply it to a different society.
Thank you, Professor Brennan. When I was watching your presentation, I was thinking a great deal about evolutionary psychology, and obviously the example of Cohen's small picnic is exactly the way that we evolved as human beings. And I think one of the problems we have is that we attempt to expand that, or your family for that matter, we attempt to expand that microcosm to a macrocosm, and I think that's one of the reasons why people have this failed intuition. So, you could make all the arguments you've made simply on the basis of evolutionary psychology. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with that argument. Maybe you might have gotten it from Deirdre McCloskey. I know that, quotes him at the beginning, I can't remember his name. F.A. Hayek made that argument in The Fatal Conceit, right? That we have these intuitions about caring, and we evolved to live in small family clans of roughly 100 people. It turns out that that's like the magic number, somewhere between 100 and 120. Right? Even like small-scale socialist societies of genuine communism, they work well when they're around 100 people or less, and when they get to be more than that, they don't work. So for example, the Hutterite societies in North America, they have a rule that when they get to be over 100 people, half of them have to go form a new colony, because that's what we're designed for, through evolution, for small-scale societies of 100. And then over the past really roughly about 400 generations, we've been living in these macro societies where we're constantly interacting with genuine strangers that we don't know. And our brains aren't adapted for that. So of course, I think we have this desire that, like, wouldn't it be great if all of society were kind of like a family? Cohen, I think, would respond to you by being like, you're right that that's what human beings are like, and you're right that maybe we can't fix that, unless maybe without some sort of hardcore genetic engineering or something. We can't fix that now. But it would still be nice if we could have the whole world be like a family, maybe with a couple emendations, because, you know, if like someone in my family dies, I'm really upset. But, you know, what is the song with the cowbell? 40,000 men and women every day. Don't fear the reaper. Thank you. Don't fear the reaper. 40,000 men and women are dying every day. I don't want to cry over all of them. So something like a high degree of concern for everybody, if not as much love as I have for like my actual family members. That'd be nice, though you're right, there's a big psychological barrier. But Cohen just says, again, that's a problem with human nature. His view is we shouldn't dumb down, when we're asking what a perfectly just society would look like, we can't dumb it down to accommodate bad parts of human nature. I find that pretty convincing, but I just don't think it leads to the conclusion he thinks it leads to.
On this piece of paper, I should say I have 3 raffle winners, the names of 3 raffle winners, which I will announce at the end of the discussion period. So you might want to hang in there till the end.
Let me see if I can figure out the right
And the
distance.
raffle prizes are what? Are they good things?
Okay, so I think, so a lot of your argument, or like the crux of your argument, is about 2 comparisons: real capitalism versus real socialism, and ideal socialism versus ideal capitalism. And I fear that you're underestimating the potentially transformative effect of socialism on people. So I'll give a realistic example of this. So lots of research in psychology seems to suggest that when you pay people to do things, they care about doing that thing for itself less. So extrinsic motivation to do something for like money, actually pushes out intrinsic motivation. So one thought could be that if we had a socialist society, we would have a lot more intrinsic motivation to do the various things that we do. And I fear that you and many people in this audience may be comparing the ideal capitalist society and the ideal socialist society without accounting for the changes that might come with being in an ideal socialist society, such as, for instance, being able to enjoy a lot more of the work you actually end up doing.
Yeah, good point. So you're bringing up something. It turns out, I brought that up. Part 3 of the book, Markets Without Limits, is my extended answer to you. It's all about what you're talking about. It's called the crowding out objection. Yeah, something called the over-justification effect, the crowding out effect, and so on. For what it's worth, so part of the reason I get into that is because Cohen, if he were here, he'd be like, nah, that's just a Marxist fantasy. He might be wrong about it, but that's his view. He's like, no, early Marxists had this view. They're like, oh, well, socialism isn't working because people are really selfish, but that's because they've been brought up in a capitalist society. And capitalism leads to, in his own words, a hypertrophy of greed. Right? It exacerbates our natural greediness. And if you were brought up in a socialist society, you would be brought up with a different set of virtues and ideals, and you'd be maybe nicer. And lots of Marxists thought that back in the past, and many think it now. Cohen, for what it's worth, thinks it's bogus. And so he's on my side and being like, I don't think so. But nevertheless, you're right that there are these experiments which seem to show that maybe money crowds out intrinsic justification. So here's an example. There's many of them, but this is like the one that everybody cites. It's this case involving Haifa, Israel. Is that the one you're thinking of? Like a Haifa daycare case where parents are showing up late. This is done in the 70s. They're showing up late to pick up their kids from the daycare. And some economists have this idea of running an experiment to see what happens when they introduce a small monetary fine. Now, what you'd expect a priori is that as the price goes up, the quantity demanded of picking up the kids late will go down. That's how demand curves go. The higher the price, the fewer people are going to accept it. That's what you'd expect. What in fact actually happens is that when they first introduce the monetary fine, it's a very small fine. It's like the equivalent of a couple dollars. More parents start picking up their kids late. And then when they keep rising, at a certain point, it goes back down. They start bringing up fewer. And one interpretation of this result is that parents had a more than arm's length relationship with the daycare workers. I felt bad that I was putting you out by picking up my kid late. But then when you tell me I can pick them up for $3, I'm like, no big deal. I don't care about you anymore, and I'm willing to do, that's a good deal. Like, it's just a service you're providing. So that's one interpretation, but it's ambiguous between another interpretation, which is money means something, and prices mean something. So you don't know this about me, but now you do. I hate it when people put dishes in the sink and don't clean them and don't put them in the dishwasher, especially when they rinse it out and the dishwasher's right there. The sink is for use. If you leave dishes in the sink, I really hate that. I had college roommates who can tell you about how I react to that. When there was a point where, talking about private property, I owned the pots and the pans and the dishes, and I took them away for the week to force everyone to comply with my anal retentiveness with regard to kitchens. So one thing is that prices might mean something. So if I offer you, if I'm constantly complaining about dishes in the sink, and I'm finally I've had it up to here, from now on, every time you leave a dish in the sink, I'm going to make you pay me a penalty, and that penalty is a nickel. You're like, oh, I thought it was a really big deal, but it's apparently only a nickel. I guess if that's all that it takes to make you whole, I guess I was mistaken in thinking such as a big deal. So that problem with that experiment and a few other ones like it is that they're ambiguous. So there's some more recent experiments. So one thing is they do things where they have a crowd of people and you introduce money. It turns out that with large crowds, money makes people more trusting of one another. With very small groups of people who know each other, introducing money signals arm's length relationships and makes them a little bit less trusting. So it helps big groups cohere, hurts small groups. There's a number of studies that have been done by people like Herbert Gintis, Sam Bowles, Paul Zak, and others, where they play these economics games all over the world. Some of these games include things, you probably heard about these, like the trust game. So you've heard this, but I'll say it for the other people. The trust game is a game where you and another player you don't know, you're strangers, you'll never see each other. I give you $10. You have the option of sending as much money as you want to the second player. However much money you send to him, we're going to multiply it by 3. So if you give him 10, he gets 30. He can then send as much back as he wants to you. If you're perfectly trustworthy and you trust him, you'll give him all 10. And if he's trustworthy, he'll give you 15 back. There's games like that. There's another game called Dictator. There's Prisoner's Dilemma you've probably heard of. A game called the Ultimatum Game. And these are games that test things like people's trustworthiness, trusting behavior, cooperativeness, tendency to cheat, their unconditional generosity, and their willingness to punish at their own personal expense moral defection from others. So what Gintis, who was a Marxist economist when we started doing these experiments, said is, he's not anymore, he's trying to prove that markets corrupt us. But the funny thing he keeps finding is that, in fact, the biggest predictor, cultural predictor that you'll be trusting, trustworthy, unconditionally generous, kind, cooperative, and so on, is that you come from a market-oriented society. People who come from either socialist societies or traditional non-market, non-socialist societies actually play these games much worse. So I think it's a really good question. There's lots to be said about it, which was on the board a second ago. I think money sometimes makes us like this and sometimes brings us together. I think its overall effect of commerce is ameliorative. And I don't have a lot of hope for moral transformation of really bringing people up in a social society, turning them into perfectly virtuous people. I think a better argument would be something like what Tyler Cowen, the economist, asked Peter Singer, the philosopher, which is if you could genetically engineer your children to be perfect altruists, would you do it? Right, so that's a good question. Maybe we could get perfect altruism through engineering. I don't think we can do it through socialization. But I might be wrong.
Thank you for the presentation today. It was great.
Thanks.
On a follow-up to what you were just talking about, I'm going to try not to use analogies here. But people who do not know how to play the game are not able to play the game competitively, per se. So, looking at a socialist-leaning society, would it be right to argue that introducing, perfect capitalism to that society is not in that society's best interest? And assuming that the answer is that it's probably not best to introduce capitalism immediately, what would you suggest is the best way to transform a society that is that's struggling, I guess, for lack of a better term?
So you're asking me if I imagine a society of Cohenite angels that happens to be all socialist, what would happen if I gave them the option to be capitalist? I guess, I think they'd figure it out. You can run sort of experiments with young children. I did this yesterday, right? I do a game called the trading game. You might have heard it. It's this really simple game. I come in, I give everybody a piece of candy. I get at random. I'm you might not like your candy. Ask them to rate it on a scale of 1 to 10. How happy are you with your candy? And then I have a rule that you're only allowed to trade with people. I don't hold up your candy and show other people what you have, and they get jealous and their scores go down. So now we have a baseline of how people feel when they look at other people's candy. Then I have them trade with people in their row, and the rule is if you want someone to trade with you, you can, and that's it. And now all the scores either stay the same or go up. The overall scores go up, and then they can trade with anyone in the room, and the scores go up dramatically. Usually, depending on how much variety of candy I have, they usually double. So if this is 8-year-olds, I did this yesterday, and it worked. As it always works, I've done it a bunch of times. I think people can kind of figure it out. The nice thing about markets, so sometimes economists like to model human beings as perfectly rational utility maximizers, but we're not. Behavioral economics indicates otherwise. We're flawed. We're stupid sometimes. We make sometimes systematic mistakes. But at least a good thing about markets, and I think this is why Adam Smith was a better economist than, say, some people in the 1950s, is that they have a general tendency to discipline us to learn from our mistakes. That's part of what the profit loss mechanism does. Right? So if I had a hypothesis that if I buy a bunch of iPads and smash them up and turn them into sculptures of myself, that I could sell them for $100,000 a piece, I will quickly find out whether I'm right about it and learn from my mistake. So I think I trust Cohen's people to figure it out, but I wouldn't force it on them. Because again, if they're all happy being Cohenite socialists, I'm happy for them to do it too. My view is just, why don't we just give them a few more options? Is there any reason not to? Just give them additional options. As far as real world, in the real world, you saw this with there are a lot of economists writing about this in the 1990s when the Soviet bloc fell. You take people from Eastern Europe and you put them in an American supermarket. It's called paradox of choice that you might have heard about if you read about this. They look at all the salad dressings and they're like, I can't decide. I can't figure it out. But then a couple years later, they can. People are good at putting limits on it. They're good at using heuristics. So I have a friend, this guy Amir Kamenik has written about how people choose ketchup. I guess it's a dissertation topic. And he's we use heuristics. I don't know much about ketchup, but I see that there's high-end ketchup and low-end ketchup. I assume I'm probably a mid-level ketchup consumer. So I use the context clues of my environment to figure out what's a mid-level ketchup, and I pick accordingly. And it turns out that works as a heuristic as long as there's a small number of ketchup connoisseurs that really pay a lot of attention to ketchup. So I think people can figure it out over time. That's not to say that in the real world there are market failures. There's a question of what we should do about those market failures. But I think Cohen's socialist angels would do just fine under capitalism.
Thank you. It was a great presentation. The only thing I found that you left off is, from a description of real capitalism, is 19th century capitalism, the kind of capitalism that mandated 20-hour work days, infants working in coal mines. And I think one of the arguments from Marx was ultimately capitalism will corrupt any form of government towards less regulation. And this is what we're saying. And can you speak to that?
Yeah, good. So I don't have stats about 19th century capitalism ready, but I do have some stuff about, maybe we'll call the slides back up. All right. So here's a hypothesis about workers in the 19th century. They're stupid and they don't love their kids. Do you agree? No? Then where's your objection coming from? That's what I wonder. Because here's what would happen. You're working on the fields, and it's lovely, and you're a peasant, and you have this lovely peasant lifestyle. And then someone has this idea, what if I go to Manchester, England, and go work in a factory, and they show up, and it totally sucks. They get paid less, they work longer hours, and get paid less. Well, that's true, but they could have moved elsewhere where there were fields. They moved to the factories. There were fields in the Americas, there were fields in other parts of the world, and a lot of them did move, right? And some of them did stay on the fields. So they show up in the factory, and then, even today, we're seeing this kind of thing happening, say, in China, where they're not getting kicked off the fields, but they still move to, the cities. So they show up, and if it sucked and they were getting paid less, they'd, phone home and say, don't come here, right? And so if you see, people are having their kids work, my hypothesis is that parents around the world love their kids as much as I love my kids. If they're having their kids work, it's probably because they think, given the crappy constraints and options they have available to them, this is their best option. So at the time that Marx was writing, he was I think that capitalism is going to miserate the proletariat and enrich the capitalist. He was right partway. It did, in fact, enrich the capitalist, but it also made the proletariat richer at the same time. Not as quickly, because of the Kuznets curve. Economic growth went like that, and then started to go more like that. Right? So even 19th century capitalism was awful compared to what we have now. I think it was pretty good compared to what they had beforehand. in part because if it weren't so good, the workers wouldn't have done it. Now, almost every single society that's been capitalist has gone through this sort of sweatshop, crappy transition period. The growth leaders like the United States and England and Germany, their crappy 19th century capitalism was like 70 years, and then they had enough capital accumulation that they grew out of it. Other countries like South Korea and Japan that have done this more recently, thanks to the effects of catch-up growth, they do it only like 25 years. So yeah, I think there's a lot to hate about 19th century capitalism. I think there's a lot to hate about the way the economy was structured beforehand. But the nice thing about it is, even though it's awful, it's historically been a temporary phase that people eventually grow out of.
I'm wondering how you conceive of the welfare state. So classic libertarians say it's sort of a parasite on capitalism and in clash with capitalism. Some modern libertarians like Niskanen and Center say it's inherent part of capitalism. Most leftists will say, well, it's not part of capitalism, it's grafted on and it's saving capitalism from itself somehow. So how do you conceive of it? And then bonus question, what do you think we should do about welfare state?
Okay, I'll take 3 hours on that one. So I often call myself like a bleeding heart libertarian because I accept principles of social justice, and I accept in principle as an empirical question that it might call for government redistribution, even though a perfectly just society wouldn't have any government. Like, the fact we have government is a flaw in us. Like, that's a problem with us. I'm also more optimistic about whether anarchism can work in the real world with bad people than average philosophers are. You can read like Peter Leeson's book, Anarchy Unbound, and some other books to see why I might think that. Or actually, Mike Humer here at the University of Colorado has a lot to say about it as well. So that said, I kind of like the way like the Fraser Institute or even like the Heritage Institute do this, where when they're ranking countries, like when they take Denmark and Sweden and Norway, the proper way to describe them, I think, would be free market welfare states. Even like, don't just take it from me, like the Prime Minister of Denmark rebuking Bernie Sanders. Sanders is like, I want to be socialist like Denmark. And he said, no, we're a free market society. And he's right. When it comes to things like business freedom, labor freedom, monetary freedom, the ability to start a business, freedom from regulation, they actually rank higher than the US on almost all of these measures in any given year, but they get dinged because they have an expansive welfare state, right? And their welfare state works better than ours. For what it's worth, we actually spend a lot of money on welfare in the US. We're just really bad at it. Per capita, we only spend about $1,000 less in person-to-person transfers than Sweden. But we have worse results because we're not very good at spending that money. We do a lot of giving it to old people rather than giving it to poor people. We're giving it to like upper middle class college students rather than giving it to like poor people. So that's a problem with us. So in principle, I think in order to justify, this is something I found convincing with, say, John Rawls. John Rawls says private property, or actually even Locke says this. He's like, private property, when you take a piece of the universe and you say, this is mine, no one else can cross that, the immediate thing that you do is you limit other people's freedom. What could possibly justify that? So an answer that Locke gives is, well, you can compensate them. What if it turns out that the process of enclosing this means that there's more stuff to be had for everybody, right? Then the game of private property is a good game to play. If everyone has more stuff, right? And that's true. Like, it turns out that, I got to Virginia relatively late, and I don't own like a giant farmland, but I have more stuff than the people who settled here first 12,000 years ago. Right? I have more wealth. So the game of property benefits me as a latecomer. But in order to justify that game, we need to make sure, like, to justify it to every single person subject to it, it should be the kind of thing where the rules are structured in a way that nobody slips through the cracks through no fault of their own. It's probably impossible to have literally no one fall through the cracks, but you should have some general kind of rules about property that make it so that people in general do well, including the worst off. And now, as an empirical question, which regime that is, for something for economists and social scientists to answer. Right? John Rawls himself, who I'm getting this kind of argument from, he says, he doesn't even want there to be a lot of redistribution. He just wants to structure property rights in such a way that it's not really necessary. So is a welfare state necessary? Is it better than the alternatives? I think there's a pretty good empirical argument that we don't know how to make the system work that well without it. So actually, you asked me about like capitalists pushing for deregulation, or was it you that said that? That was the second question. Yeah. By the way, so I forgot to mention that. Actually, Milton Friedman, I think, is right about this. You have to protect capitalism from the capitalists. Adam Smith said the same thing. The biggest enemies of the free market system are the rich people. Like, they're constantly, I work in DC, and in DC there are office hours that Congress people have, just like I have office hours. And what happens is rich corporations show up to lobby for regulations that benefit them. I'm not saying all regulations are bad. However, many regulations are not done, and many government-to-government transfers are not done in order to benefit the common good. They're done to benefit a particular group. Like there's a company called Archer Daniels Midland that makes into every single economics textbook. And every year they go up to the government and they go, can you give us $700 million for corn subsidies? And also, can you make it so that sugar is artificially expensive? And then the economists universally like, don't do that. It's a terrible idea. It hurts the public. It hurts the public more than hell's ADM. And the government says yes. And the reason they do it is because we have a problem that's, I think, endemic to capitalism, because even if you had like a complete laissez-faire capitalism, people are going to lobby and chip away at it so you get this. That you get rent seeking, that's a technical term for this, because of a phenomenon of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs. If you can get a $700 million prize from me distributing a favor, you're going to be willing to spend like $600 million and a lot of effort to get it. But then the cost of these things are spread among the many. Right? So the sugar tariff maybe cost me $2 a year. I work in DC. Congress is 20 minutes down the road. I actually know people who work there who could like help me out. I'm not going to lobby against it. What's the point? It costs me more to lobby against it than to just eat it. But this happens over and over again. Nevertheless, I do have a slide on this, which maybe I can call back up right now. No. It turns out that if you try to measure rent seeking, I think it's an inherent feature of capitalist societies, but the amount of rent seeking is negatively correlated with how capitalist they are on the Fraser rankings. Right? So the more kind of capitalistic societies tend to have a little bit less rent seeking than the less capitalist societies. The more mixed economy you get, the more rent seeking you get. So it's not to say that if only, like James Buchanan and other economists might say, if only we had perfect laissez-faire capitalism, there would be no rent seeking. I think if we had perfectly laissez-faire capitalism, give it 20 minutes and it will turn into like a rent-seeking, non-perfectly laissez-faire capitalist society. But still, there is a negative correlation with capitalism and this kind of behavior. Capitalists want to stifle competition. That's why Amazon, there's a point where eBay and Amazon were thinking about sales tax, and Amazon lobbied on behalf of certain sales taxes because it hurts eBay more. There's a point where you see certain corporations lobbying on behalf of an increased minimum wage. Why? Is it because suddenly saints took over that corporation, or is it because they go, we can eat it, we're a big corporation, and it hurts our competitors more, hurts mom and pop stores more, so they'll buy from us. So this is built into capitalism. I don't think we can avoid it. The question is just how can we mitigate it as much as possible?
Good time for one more question. Go right here.
You compared ideal capitalism with ideal socialism and then realistic capitalism with realistic socialism. But it seems to me that current realistic socialism and capitalism is not the same as kind of an ideal and realistic socialism and capitalism. So say you a la Rawls put in some welfare things so that everyone could pursue their own conception of the good on the capitalist side. And then you also, for the socialists, you said, maybe term limits or something and something to stop dictators, something like that. And so if you consider ideal but realistic capitalism and ideal but realistic socialism, would your argument change?
Yeah, I think maybe more generally to put it is, in the real world, given flawed people like us, given the constraints of political economy, including that whatever rules you set into place, people are going to try to change those rules. There's a question of what's the optimal level of government regulation? What's the optimal level of government intervention? What's the optimal level of government control versus market versus non-market civil society, right? And if Larry Temkin were here and we had the debate we were going to have, we'd probably be debating some of that stuff, and I'd be a little more on one side than another. Right now, I'm writing a book with a philosopher named Dick Arneson called Debating Capitalism, and it's not going to be socialism versus capitalism. It's literally going to be what's the best feasible form of capitalism given the constraints that we face. I think these are really interesting questions. I tend to think, there's a lot to be said for kind of free market welfare state. I think that there's a lot to be said for anarchism working better than people give it credit for. I think that there are non-governmental alternatives to certain kinds of redistribution that are functional, and I don't mean just giving to charity, because people don't give a lot to charity. When they give a lot to charity, they're usually just trying to impress someone they're trying to be friends with or sleep with or something. That's what the data says. I mean other kinds of non-governmental transfers that can maybe work. But I might be wrong. So exactly what the mix is, I'm not really sure. That said, every highly successful society, every society in which people are generally happy, generally healthy, generally wealthy, and where even the worst people in like the 10th percentile are doing well, are societies that are very high on that Fraser index, where they're like over 7. They're robustly capitalist. If you ask economists around the world, like there's actually kind of an economic consensus about what makes countries rich, and it's robust protection of private property, open and stable government, and like open trade. Like we don't seem to know how to make people well off without that. If the facts change, if we get new data that says otherwise, I'll change my opinion. But given what we know now, I think that's the best bet.
Okay, I know there were more questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to them. I hope that many of you can stick around and have some refreshments and continue the conversation. But before we stop, I've got the names of 3 people here. I don't actually have names. I've just got their email addresses. But if one of these email addresses is yours, then you are one of the lucky winners. They're all at Colorado EDU addresses. The first one is Miev6486. The second one is Joe's9917. And the third is river.lurig, I think that says. So you're the 3 winners. Let's give a big thanks to Professor Brennan.